Describe some of the features of American Islam after the end of slavery. What is taqiyya and khutbah? How did the Nation of Islam, or the NOI, develop? How was it distinct? Who was Wallace D. Fard and Elijah Muhammad? Describe the life and legacy of Malcolm X. By the end of the 19th century, slavery in the United States was over as a legal institution. By that point, it had been almost a century since the last West Africans were kidnapped. The U.S. halted the import of new captives from Africa in 1808. Therefore, whatever Islam was still overtly present in African Americans had been fading away for some time. While there were still some traces of American Islam to be found, by the turn of the 20th century, the presence of Islam in America was at its lowest point, at least as far as the historical record can show us. It's possible that there were still significant numbers of active Muslims around even then, but it's difficult to say much. If there were African Americans who had consciously continued the Islamic religion of their ancestors, it's possible that they did not declare it openly. And there is stipulation for this in Islamic practice, called taqiyya. That is, if a Muslim is in a situation where it's not safe to be openly Muslim, it's permissible to lie about one's religion or beliefs, or to perform a practice that might otherwise be frowned upon. Was taqiyya being practiced by any African American Muslims after enslavement ended? How many? The answer is, who knows? American Islam did start to reappear in the early 20th century, though, and it took on two distinct forms. First, there's what we can call the American immigrant Islam, a gradual trickle of Muslim immigrants coming to the United States throughout American history. This did start in relatively small numbers around the 1840s with some Turks and Yemenis. Some Bosnians and Arabs also started migrating in the 1910s. The major center for Muslim settlement in the United States was in the Midwest: Michigan, North and South Dakota, Illinois, Minnesota, and Iowa, where the agricultural and industrial force of the American economy was growing in the early 20th century, and the lower population gave Muslim immigrants slightly more privacy to practice Islam openly. In 1934, the first American building specifically designed to be a masjid was erected in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Now affectionately referred to as the Mother Mosque of America, this small building is still in operation today. The gradual influx of Muslims to America would continue into the present, with a significant bump coming after the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which attempted to end discrimination in immigration policies for Asians, Africans, and non-white Europeans. The most distinctive feature of this American immigrant Islam is its diversity. According to a Pew Research poll from 2017, about 3 in 5 American Muslims are immigrants themselves. Of these, 15% of American Muslims are from Pakistan, 11% are Persian or Iranian, 7% are Indian, 6% are Bengali, another 6% are Afghani, and 5% are Iraqi. Other countries of origin for American Muslim immigrants are lower. But notice that there's no one dominant group or homeland amongst the immigrants. Even the largest group, Pakistanis, 15% of American Muslim immigrants, are numerically small. And there are Muslims who immigrate to America from nearly every nation on earth. So, American immigrant Islam is decidedly international, consisting of minorities within minorities, speaking dozens of languages besides, of course, English and Spanish. Both Sunnism and Shiism are present, and on the whole, they tend to mesh rather well together in the United States. The second arena for the appearance of American Islam comes from the African American descendants of enslaved people. This is about 40% of American Muslims today. Just for ease of reference, I'm going to call this African American Islam. Now, of course, there are Muslim African immigrants who are now Americans, but that's not who we mean here. African American, for the sake of this discussion, refers only to the people of West Africa who were enslaved and brought to America, and their direct descendants. Because African American Islam is older and larger than American immigrant Islam, it bears some features that mark it as distinct, or maybe quasi-distinct, from the American Islam of immigrants. Some of this is due to West African cultural norms that survived the enslavement process. Some of this is due to the particularities of the United States in general. Some of this is due to the effects of captivity. And some of this is due to the sustained contact with non-Muslim Americans, who are overwhelmingly white and Christian. Again, all Islams everywhere are unique to one time and place, and African American Islam is no different. As we mentioned last time, these African American Islams almost completely lacked ulum ad-din, the traditional Islamic sciences. Since captive West Africans and their children rarely had access to literature, and certainly didn't have access to Islamic literature, there's no recourse to hadith, the seerah, tafsir, falsafa, kalam, or fiqh. And hence, there's no madhabs, no madrasas, and no Sufi tariqas. No one was issuing fatwas, or running Islamic courts, or claiming any institutional form of Islam like an ulama or a government. Even if an African American Muslim had some idea of Muslim orthodoxy or orthopraxy, there was no formal way to enforce it, or even to really propagate it. This isn't as true now as it once was, however, as in the late 20th century, African American Islam started coming into much greater contact with other forms of Islam practiced by other peoples, and thus you do see the presence of some of the madhabs, madrasas, and Sufi tariqas. Further, since African American Islam is the product of enslavement, and beyond that, American racism, African American Islam centers the American conception of race much more than other Islams tend to do. Since race is such a powerful feature of American society from 1776 to now, and American conceptions of race are quite unlike other people's notions of race and ethnicity, African American Islam prioritizes race, and specifically blackness or Africanness, more than you would find anywhere else. For example, Islamic history tells us that one of the Sahaba was named Bilal. He was a black African slave who lived in Mecca. He was manumitted by Abu Bakr, and he embraced Islam under the guidance of the Prophet directly. Bilal was also the first person to give the adhan, the call to prayer from the Prophet's own mosque, since he was said to have had a very powerful voice. While Bilal does appear in the seerah and other early Islamic histories, he's much more prominent in African American thought because of his blackness and his enslavement, which strikes a very obvious parallel to the plight of the African American. Bilal is the black slave who is delivered to freedom by Islam. Even further, since American conceptions of race are always political, African American conceptions of race, blackness, and Africanness are likewise politicized. This can include some notion of black nationalism, or the belief that African American Muslims, or perhaps just all people of African descent everywhere, are different in kind than other people, especially white non-Muslim Americans. So separationism, the notion that one group of people ought to have nothing to do with another, is not uncommon. Although this isn't the rule. More equitable concepts of restorative racial justice may be just as likely to appear in African American Islam, and, for that matter, a concern with justice generally. Also, since African American Islam has always been a minority within the majority of white Muslim America, the larger culture and norms of white non-Muslim America appear as well. The notion and centrality of race would be an example of this, as would the use of the English language. Centuries of enslavement, forced illiteracy, and the distance from Islamic educational systems also made knowledge of Arabic, Niger-Congo tongues, and other Islamicate languages almost nil. It's not uncommon to encounter African American Muslims reading the Quran in English translation or saying their prayers in English. Although again, this has changed quite a bit in the second half of the 20th century when there was more contact with the wider Islamic world. Other aspects of white America are also apparent in African American Islam, much more so than in other Islams. For instance, in most noontime Friday prayer services at mosques around the world, there is a khutbah, or hutbeh in Turkish, a sermon given after the salat is performed. The khutbah can be a reflection on the Quran, the Sunnah, or just the affairs of the day, whatever the given prayer leader would like. In the context of African American Islam, the khutbah is much more likely to be akin to Protestant Christian notions of sermonizing or prophetic speech, with the use of call and response, oral formula like rhyming or meter, and the use of personal anecdote. Street preaching, or preaching in large auditoriums, is also not unheard of. And from American Reform Judaism, sometimes prayer spaces for African American Muslims are called temples, and not always masjids or mosques. The largest organization of African American Muslims was and remains the Nation of Islam, or the NOI. Its origins are rather murky, but surround a mysterious figure named Wallace D. Fard, or Farad Muhammad, who was active in Detroit in the 1930s. We don't know for sure who he was or where he was from. He claims to have been from Mecca, but there are mixed reports on him being either an Arab, a Turk, or an African American. The Great Depression had just begun, and African American families in the Midwest were struck especially hard. And to them, Fard brought a message of hope and deliverance in the form of Islam, the so-called forgotten religion and way of life of the Black Americans' ancestors. The culture of white America was by its very nature oppressive of the children of the African diaspora, and thus it must be rejected. Turning to the religion of Islam as Fard understood it, the religion of African Americans' forebears was part of that restoration of Black identity. The Black American was a member of the lost Muslim tribe of Shabazz, whose history, language, and religion was stolen from them by slavery and racism. To this, in 1930, Fard established what he would call the Lost Found Nation of Islam in the wilderness of North America. This Nation of Islam would function at once as a charity, an educational organization, and a collective working towards African American liberation, all in orbit around the quintessential questions of the African American Muslim. What does it mean to be Black in a white person's country? What does it mean to be removed from the culture of one's ancestors and subjugated to another? What does it mean to have your history erased? What does it mean to be a Muslim living under the oppression of Christians? When the world was dissatisfying, if not overtly violent, to so many African Americans, the Nation of Islam could provide clarity, unity, and dignity. As quickly and mysteriously as Fard appeared on the scene and created the NOI, he disappeared. He was last seen in Detroit in June of 1934. It's still not clear what happened to him. Leadership of the new organization then passed to one of Fard's assistants, a man named Elijah Muhammad. There was a tension in the organization over Elijah Muhammad's claim to leadership, but Elijah Muhammad claimed that Fard had been training him as a successor for over 3 years. Furthermore, Elijah Muhammad began to make remarkable claims about Fard, which he says he learned during these years of private training. Fard supposedly revealed to him that he was a new prophet, sent to deliver the lost people of Africa in America, the Muslim tribe of Shabazz. And even further, Elijah Muhammad claimed that Fard was God incarnate, and that Fard had revealed this to Elijah Muhammad in confidence. Therefore, Elijah Muhammad was also a prophet or messenger of God, since he alone knew the secret information about God in the person of Fard. Although from time to time Muslims have claimed to have new prophets, despite the now common Muslim claim that Muhammad was the last prophet, Elijah Muhammad's claim about Fard as an incarnation of God is very unusual for a Muslim to make. A number of immigrant Muslims who caught wind of this claim even denounced the NOI as false Muslims, heretics, or not speaking on behalf of so-called real or orthodox Islam. The Nation of Islam would wield a special force amongst African Americans for just the same claims about Fard and Elijah Muhammad. In the NOI, not only was there an African American prophet who could offer deliverance, God himself appeared on earth to endorse this organization. And besides, African American Muslims were not working at this time within the matrix of the Ulum ad-Din, the traditional Islamic sciences. So the fact that they were making arguments and held beliefs that Muslims in other places would find scandalous was frankly irrelevant. What the Nation of Islam did have was a centuries-old experience of non-Muslim American religion and culture. So, for an African-American Muslim to claim that God had been incarnated as a human being wasn't that far from the claims of American Christians, which most of the members of the NOI had formerly been. Although many white Americans saw the ascendant Nation of Islam as strange, if not dangerous, Elijah Muhammad and the NOI provided many African Americans a chance at a new life despite the scourge of American racism. By the time of Elijah Muhammad's death in 1975, there were over 70 Nation of Islam centers across the United States. Although the nation still exists today, following Elijah Muhammad's passing, the group split into two now opposed factions. On the one side was Louis Farrakhan, a protege of Elijah Muhammad, who wanted to keep the organization oriented towards African American separationism. On the other side was Warith Din Muhammad, one of Elijah Muhammad's sons, who tried to reconcile the Nation of Islam with the beliefs and cultures of Sunni Islam found elsewhere. The most famous member of the NOI, and indeed the most influential American Muslim in history, was the man who came to be known as Malcolm X. Born Malcolm Little to a Baptist family in Omaha, Nebraska in 1925, Malcolm grew up surrounded by the threats of racial violence. After a number of run-ins with the Ku Klux Klan, the family fled to Wisconsin and then to Michigan, where white supremacists burned down the family home. Soon after, Malcolm's father, Earl Little, died in an unusual streetcar accident, which is commonly believed by both Malcolm and others to have been murdered by the same white nationalists who had burnt down their house. Meanwhile, the stress of her husband's death and the continued torment of her children led Malcolm's mother, Louise, to be institutionalized in a mental hospital for over 20 years. Malcolm and his siblings were thus taken apart from one another and placed into separate homes for foster care. In his young adulthood, Malcolm relocated frequently, first to live with family in Boston, then to Flint, Michigan, then Harlem in New York, and then finally back to Boston, where he got involved in several petty crimes. In 1946, Malcolm was arrested and sent to prison for connections to a number of burglaries. While imprisoned, Malcolm began to gain interest in this new Nation of Islam movement, which several of his siblings had already joined. Malcolm began to write letters to Elijah Muhammad, and the two kept a correspondence for several years. Sometime around 1950, Malcolm dropped his family name Little and would instead sign his name as Malcolm X. The last name, Little, Malcolm would often have to explain, was not the name of his ancestors' family, but the name of the white slave owners who had subjugated his family. Enslaved Americans often took the last names of the white families that claimed to own them. By leaving a stark X in lieu of a name, NOI members like Malcolm could remind themselves and others that their true identities had been taken by violence. In 1952, Malcolm X left prison and finally met Elijah Muhammad in person. Elijah Muhammad was quite taken with him and saw in him what so many other people would soon see too. A powerful, tall, quick-witted, and charming man with good looks and a sharp intellect. That is, someone captivating. Malcolm quickly rose through the ranks of the Nation of Islam and was attracting a lot of attention, as well as converts, with his challenging sermons and likable grace. And although Elijah Muhammad remained in charge of the NOI, by the end of the 1950s, Malcolm X was its face and voice in print and on television. While on the one hand, this made Malcolm a man of power and influence, on the other, it made him the target of attacks of various kinds. But Malcolm made no apologies. He condemned white America for its crimes against African Americans, and likewise condemned other black civil rights leaders for not taking stronger stances on behalf of racial justice. He wasn't interested in the nonviolent tactics of people like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Instead, Malcolm famously said that African Americans should defend themselves and take their due rights by any means necessary. By 1963, Malcolm X was starting to become disenchanted with the Nation of Islam as a whole, and Elijah Muhammad specifically. After Elijah Muhammad failed to respond to several instances of police brutality in a manner which Malcolm thought was adequate, and then Malcolm learned of Elijah Muhammad's sexual affairs with several women, Malcolm slowly started to back away from his mentor and turned towards the greater civil rights movement, which he had previously condemned as ineffective. Then, following the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, a reporter asked Malcolm for a comment. Malcolm X responded that this was simply a case of the chickens coming home to roost, meaning that these events were the eventual outcome of America's more violent and racist tendencies. In other words, America is going to get what's coming to it. Elijah Muhammad was furious and tried to silence Malcolm, but it was too late. Malcolm X's influence and popularity had completely eclipsed Elijah Muhammad's. And then, in the following year, 1964, Malcolm X cut ties with the NOI forever. Looking for a new spiritual home, Malcolm had slowly started to explore Sunni Islam as it's typically understood. In an effort to make contact with a more global vision of Islam, Malcolm X did as so many Muslims had done since ancient times. He would go on the Hajj and make several trips to famous Islamic cities across the Middle East and Africa. Although Malcolm X didn't speak Arabic or any other Islamicate language, he found to his shock that he had a kind of celebrity that preceded him everywhere he went. He was made the official guest of the Saudi royal family when he arrived in Arabia. He was invited to join the government of the Egyptian president Gamal Abdel Nasser. And at the University of Ibadan in Nigeria, the students gave him the honorary Yoruba title of Omawale, the child who came back home. Malcolm X would later write, Never would I have even thought of dreaming that I would ever be a recipient of such honors. Honors that in America would be bestowed upon a king, not a Negro. But it was the Hajj specifically that made the strongest effect on him. Now using the Arabic name Malik Ash-Shabazz, he wrote of a great experience of spiritual awakening that he found in Mecca. His experience of Tawheed, the unity of God, led Malik to find in Islam hope for the potential unity of humanity. I have been blessed to visit the holy city of Mecca. There were tens of thousands of pilgrims from all over the world. They were of all colors, from blue-eyed blondes to black-skinned Africans. But we were all participating in the same ritual, displaying a spirit of unity and brotherhood that my experiences in America had led me to believe never could exist between the white and the non-white. America needs to understand Islam, because this is the one religion that erases from its society the race problem. Throughout my travels in the Muslim world, I have met, talked to, and even eaten with people who in America would have been considered white. But the white attitude was removed from their minds by the religion of Islam. I have never before seen sincere and true brotherhood practiced by all colors together, irrespective of their color. You may be shocked by these words coming from me, but on this pilgrimage, what I have seen and experienced has forced me to rearrange much of my thought patterns previously held and to toss aside some of my previous conclusions. When Malik returned to the United States, he continued to reach out to other black civil rights leaders, as well as several Sunni Muslim organizations and some socialist groups. Meanwhile, many members of the Nation of Islam, perhaps working in concert with the FBI, began to make veiled and not so veiled threats against Malik. His home was burnt down for the second time in his life. The official newspaper of the Nation of Islam openly stated that Malcolm was worthy of death for his supposed betrayal. And in 1965, Malik Ash-Shabazz, Malcolm X, was gunned down by NOI members while giving an address in New York City. So why does Malcolm X matter so much? First, there's his role in the American Civil Rights Movement involving all African Americans. While many other leaders preached restraint and slow progress, Malcolm stood strong and fearless. African Americans had been treated unjustly by their nation and its history, and Malcolm publicly and unapologetically demanded restitutions and transformations of this society now. He wasn't just an African American who stood up to a white person. He was an African American who stood up to whiteness in a direct, visceral way. His pain and his righteous anger had no time for subtlety. Regarding his role as a figure within Islamic history, Malcolm transformed African American Islam and brought it into the view of the whole world for the first time. Muslims from around the world were now aware of the struggle and painful story of the American Muslim, a once lost branch of the Ummah. And conversely, Malcolm brought African American Muslims into greater awareness of global Islam, its languages, its cultures, its histories, and its practices. And in a particular way, Malcolm X has been and remains the image of the American Muslim, both the descendant of slavery and the fighter for liberation, the nationalist NOI preacher and the Sunni convert. Indeed, the multifaceted nature of Malcolm X is what makes him so compelling even today. Usually when someone's famous, it's for being or doing one specific thing. But Malcolm's different. He's a man who's notable for his ability to change, to grow, reconsider, and adapt. Both a contemplative and a man of action. A rare combination. someone both fierce and funny, aggressive and yet reflective. He allows the Muslim, and especially the African American Muslim, to see what they need to see in a single, complete human being. As historian Michael Eric Dyson says in his analysis of Malcolm X, his complexity is our gift. Describe some of the features of American Islam after the end of slavery. What is taqiyya and khutbah? How did the Nation of Islam, or the NOI, develop? How was it distinct? Who was Wallace D. Fard and Elijah Muhammad? Describe the life and legacy of Malcolm X.